Vandrex Mortis was a hive world of ceaseless twilight, its spires clawing at skies choked with soot and ash, scraping against clouds of pollution that shimmered with the faint green glow of warp contamination. Hive Spire Noctilux, the city's oldest and tallest segment, loomed over lower levels like a jagged crown of blackened steel and stone. Within its twisting stairways, conduits, and vent shafts, life moved like a nervous current. Endless footsteps, the hiss of pneumatic tubes, the steady grind of machinery, all beneath a sky that never showed the sun. Deep in the lower administrative tiers, where the air was thick and metallic with the smell of oil and mold, lay a vault that had been forgotten even by the diligent records of the administratum. Its entrance was concealed behind stacked crates of archival codices and rusted piping. It was here that Urek, a pale, jittery archivist with a nervous twitch in his left eye, discovered a crate that had no record of delivery. The wood was splintered and grayed by time, its locks eaten through with corrosion, yet it radiated an uncanny aura, a hum that seemed almost sentient, brushing against Urek's mind like a faint whisper in a crowded room. With trembling fingers, he pried the crate open. Inside lay a single Terran book, its cover brittle and blackened, its pages blank. No title, no author, no markings of any kind, yet the air around it felt charged, alive with a subtle, almost imperceptible pulse. Urek reached out, and as his fingers grazed the cover, a shiver ran through him, as if the book had exhaled. He opened the first page. Words began to form, curling ink on blank paper, letters flowing in slow, deliberate formation. He blinked. The sentences described the vault in vivid detail, including the positions of archivists, the humming of servitors, the flicker of the lumens overhead. 3 archivists, Mara and Tomas among them, watched silently. Their eyes reflected the flickering light as they read, disbelief etched into their faces. When Urek read aloud, the air seemed to thicken. The words carried weight, pulling at the vault itself, bending shadows toward the book, stretching the darkness at the edges of vision. What is this?" Mara whispered, her hands clutching the nearest table. It's alive, isn't it?" Before Urek could answer, Tomas stepped forward, drawn by curiosity. Surveillance footage later showed him walking toward the book, and then nothing. No image, no residual motion, only the faint, hollow echo of laughter reverberated through the ventilation shafts. Urek's heartbeat spiked. The vault itself seemed to shiver in response. Servitors nearby faltered. Ocular lenses flickered on and off. Cogitators looped subroutines endlessly. Vox links hissed and spat static. The book resisted attempts to move it, its weight in his hands impossibly heavy and yet impossibly light, as if it were bound to his grip and yet teasing him. Shadows stretched unnaturally in corners, flickering, twisting as if breathing. And the laughter, low, teasing, playful, echoed, as if the ducts themselves had learned the sound of mockery. Over the next hours, minor incidents escalated. Ink smudges on nearby codices rearranged themselves into patterns, glyphs that made the skin crawl when read. The vault's air thickened, carrying the scent of old paper, machinery, and something sweet, metallic, and wrong. Each breath felt weighted, each step measured. A subtle tug on Jurek's mind urged him to read further, to turn each page, to immerse himself fully, though each word pulled him deeper into unease. By the second cycle, more archivists had vanished. One disappeared while cataloging ledgers, another while adjusting a servitor's ocular lens. Each absence left a hollow in the hive's surveillance, a silence that the laughter filled with teasing clarity. Shadows began to move independently, dancing along walls and ceilings, sometimes converging into vague humanoid shapes, then dissipating like smoke when approached. News of the anomalies trickled to higher levels of the administratum. Official reports dismissed them as minor misfires, hallucinations caused by hive toxins, or technical errors. Yet citizens began whispering, noticing fleeting glimpses of figures where none should be, feeling invisible eyes tracking their movements in dark alleys and maintenance shafts. Fear spread like an infection, quickened by curiosity and rumor. Jurek attempted to destroy the book. Sparks touched its cover, flames licked at the brittle leather, and yet the book remained unmarked. It pulsed faintly under his touch, as if mocking the very notion of destruction. The text had evolved again, now predicting movements in real time, describing the vault and its corridors, the positions of those still alive, even their thoughts and fears. Pages detailed the path of a janitorial servitor moments before it walked through the lower hallways, the flicker of shadows in vents, the exact positions of security drones that would otherwise record nothing. The vault became a nexus of tension. Shadows whispered, the air grew oppressive, the hum of servitors and pipes thickened into an almost living symphony. Archivists quarreled, argued, and panicked. Some clutched their robes, murmuring prayers or cursing under their breath. Others attempted to flee, only to find corridors lengthened subtly, or doors that led back into the same room, the book somehow reshaping reality around them. Jurek's perspective fractured over time. He saw multiple versions of himself reflected in puddles of oil on the floor, in darkened lenses of the servitors, in the walls themselves. The book's words seemed to enter his mind directly, phrases twisting into thoughts he did not recognize, fears he had never held. Nights merged into days with no distinction. The laughter in the ducts became personalized, each echo teasing specific memories, old regrets, trivial mistakes, fears hidden in his childhood. By the seventh cycle, a pattern emerged. The book was not only recording reality, but manipulating it, responding to observers, testing reactions. Shadows coalesced into indistinct forms that watched, waited. A minor tremor passed through the spire as machinery faltered, lights dimmed in flickering irregular intervals. Even citizens unaware of the vault reported glimpses of impossible movement, hearing whispers, shadows that breathed, corridors that seemed longer when approached. Finally, during a particularly long vigil, Jurek opened the last page he dared approach. Words scrawled across the paper, describing him in minute detail, capturing his memories, fears, and thoughts before he could even articulate them. Each line pulsed like a heartbeat. Then, mid-sentence, the letters shivered and disappeared. Jurek vanished without trace. The vault was silent, save for a final soft echo of laughter and the hum of a book waiting for its next reader. Outside, Vandrex Mortis continued its endless grind. Citizens whispered of shadows in the corners of alleys, the feeling of being watched, fleeting glimpses of figures that belonged to neither human nor machine. But the book, sealed and alone in its forgotten vault, continued its quiet work. It recorded, it shaped, it observed, and it waited patiently. The governor's palace of Vandrex Mortis had been constructed to inspire awe, submission, and paperwork. Vast marble staircases ascended toward vaulted ceilings, painted with scenes of imperial triumph, each victory carefully annotated in gilded high Gothic. Servo skulls drifted through perfumed air, reciting attendance rosters in monotone. Crystal chandeliers shimmered beneath stained glass depictions of planetary compliance. On the morning Slappy arrived, the palace orchestra was instructed to play something diplomatically neutral. No one knew what that meant. The crate was carried into the grand audience chamber by 6 laborers and 1 junior relic curator who looked profoundly uncomfortable. The crate was lacquered black, stamped with sigils of authentication from 3 separate administratum sub-branches and 1 Ordo Antiquities certification. Governor Halbrecht Morn watched from his elevated throne, fingers steepled, expression carefully neutral. "Proceed," he said. The curator cleared his throat. "Your Excellency, by decree of the Intersector Cultural Exchange Accord, you are hereby granted custodianship of a pre-compliance Terran diplomatic relic. Said artifact is designated Slappy." The crate lid creaked open. Inside sat a wooden dummy dressed in a small black suit, red bow tie perfectly centered, painted smile sharp and confident. Its glassy eyes reflected the chandelier light with uncanny precision. Silence filled the chamber. The curator swallowed. Historical records suggest the relic was used in ancient Terran diplomatic rituals. "Satire?" Governor Morn repeated faintly. A faint wooden click echoed. Several officials stiffened. The dummy's head tilted slightly to the left. No one commented. Slappy was placed on a velvet cushion at the governor's right during the afternoon council session. High Chancellor Veritas began the briefing. "Manufactorum output remains stable. Minor unrest in lower hab sections is—" Click! The sound was distinct. All eyes shifted. The dummy's jaw moved. "Stable?" A sharp wooden voice echoed across the chamber. The Chancellor froze. Governor Morn blinked slowly. "Did someone speak?" The dummy's painted lips parted again. "Stable is such a flexible term," it said brightly. Several clerks dropped their data slates. The governor cleared his throat. Yes, of course." No one asked how the relic was speaking. To question the impossible required paperwork. Within 2 cycles, Slappy was formally introduced as Diplomatic Advisor Emeritus. The title required 17 approval stamps. All were granted. The dummy attended every meeting, perched comfortably on its velvet cushion, legs crossed. Its painted eyes seemed to track whoever held the floor. Policy revisions began subtly. "Why," Slappy asked during one session, "do citizens clap whenever the governor concludes a speech?" "It is a traditional display of loyalty," Veritas replied cautiously. Slappy tilted its head. "Clapping implies evaluation. Evaluation implies judgment. Judgment implies equality." Silence. The governor shifted in his throne. "That is a compelling interpretation," he murmured. Within hours, Edict LXIV-77 was drafted. All applause within the governor's presence must be rhythmically synchronized and enthusiasm calibrated. Irregular clapping constitutes destabilizing dissent. The administratum clerks worked feverishly to justify the reasoning. One drafted a 12-page thesis titled "On the Subversive Potential of Asynchronous Applause." Another cited ancient Terran precedents involving crowd psychology and destabilization theory. The edict passed unanimously. The first execution occurred 3 days later. A mid-level logistics officer concluded a fiscal summary. The chamber applauded politely. One clerk's clapping was slightly offbeat. The sound echoed sharply against marble walls. Slappy's head snapped toward him. "That one," the dummy said cheerfully. The chamber froze. Governor Morn dabbed his forehead with a silk cloth. Irregularity must be addressed. The clerk was escorted out. The orchestra resumed playing something diplomatically neutral. Policies grew increasingly refined.
Eye contact duration during meetings was regulated to prevent aggressive ocular posturing. Breathing rates were standardized to avoid anxious atmospheric disruption. Smiling curvature charts were distributed to prevent sarcastic overextension. Each decree was legally airtight, each justification impeccable, each signature trembling. The governor spoke less during sessions. When he did, he deferred. "What does our diplomatic advisor recommend?" he would ask. Slappy would swivel slightly on its cushion. "I recommend efficiency," it would reply, with crisp wooden clarity. Efficiency meant fewer discussions, fewer dissenting opinions, fewer people. Clerks began drafting policy before Slappy requested it. They anticipated absurdity and codified it preemptively. "Perhaps blinking intervals should be standardized," one suggested nervously. "Excellent," Slappy replied. A blinking compliance office was established by sunset. Governor Morn's posture deteriorated subtly. He leaned toward the dummy when speaking, as though seeking approval. His laughter came half a second too late. During one session, he began applauding before realizing applause was restricted. Slappy turned its painted gaze upon him. The governor slowly lowered his hands. "Merely testing compliance," he whispered. Slappy's wooden jaw creaked open in what might have been a smile. "Of course you were." The palace staff noticed changes. Servo skulls avoided hovering near the dummy. Candles flickered when it spoke. Its shadow stretched slightly longer than the chandelier light allowed. But none of this entered official record. Official record contained only productivity increases. Compliance rates rose dramatically. Dissent dropped to statistical invisibility. Executions for improper clapping reached 9 by the end of the month, all legally justified, all thoroughly documented. The final council session of the cycle was brief. Governor Morn stood to deliver a prepared address on unity. He spoke softly. He did not look at the assembly. He looked at the dummy. "I am proud of our progress," he said. Silence followed. No one dared clap. Slappy slowly raised one wooden hand. Clap. The single sound echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. Then it began clapping rhythmically, perfectly on beat. One by one, the officials joined in, terrified of mistiming. The applause grew louder, faster, more desperate. The governor clapped too. His rhythm faltered. For half a second, he was off beat. The chamber fell silent. Slappy turned its head slowly toward him, painted eyes gleaming. "Well," it said pleasantly, "that will never do." The chandeliers flickered. Outside the palace windows, hive noctilucks loomed in polluted twilight. Inside, the Imperium maintained perfect legal order. And at the governor's right hand, the smallest figure in the room now held the most power. The executions were scheduled before midnight. All documentation was flawless. The records would show nothing irrational. Only compliance, only order, only the echo of perfectly synchronized applause. The festival district smelled of burnt sugar and metal, an aroma that seemed to linger in every corner of the cobbled walkways, sticking to the skin like a second epidermis. I had never attended one of these celebrations, but curiosity, persistent, nagging, something almost instinctual, drove me through the gates as the first glow of the twin suns reflected off the festooned banners. Citizens milled about in anticipation, clutching crates and bundles containing masks of every conceivable shape, Animalistic, grotesque, beautiful, monstrous, and everything between. At first, it seemed innocent, a festival of artistry, a chance to revel in anonymity, to hide from the suffocating weight of daily life under Vandrix Mortis. But then came the whispering. "Choose carefully," it said, a voice or a thought or some perverse suggestion from nowhere and everywhere all at once. I looked around, trying to locate its source. The other citizens were smiling, or at least what passed for smiles beneath their intended faces. Their hands trembled slightly. Excitement coiled around their limbs like electrical wire. I hesitated at a stall where the masks hung from hooks like skinless heads, a porcelain fox with eyes too bright, a wooden mask that grinned like it had secrets, and one that seemed alive, shifting subtly in the air currents. I reached for it, and the instant my fingers brushed its surface, it adhered. The fusion was instantaneous. The mask was no longer an object in my hands. It was part of me. My fingers could no longer touch its edges. My breathing synced with its hollow cavities, its painted smile stretching over my own lips, pressing inward, fusing bone and muscle with lacquered artifice. My reflection in a polished bronze mirror caught my breath. My own eyes stared out from behind a smile that was not mine, wide, unnatural, grinning in a way I had never imagined. Panic fluttered through my chest like trapped birds, and yet the mask tightened with every heartbeat. I tried to speak. Only a whisper emerged, distorted, echoing unnaturally within my skull. Panic twisted further as I realized the voice that left my lips was not mine either. It was something older, something layered beneath my consciousness. A personality that I did not recognize, yet that felt inexorably, terrifyingly familiar. I stumbled into the crowd, hoping for some anchor, family, friends, someone I could recognize. But their faces were changing too. Or had they always been like this? My sister, eyes wide, her jaw locked in a horrified grimace, approached, and I gasped, but it was not a gasp. My throat worked differently now. My hands twitched, attempting gestures I did not intend. She recoiled. I recoiled. Nobody spoke, but communication vibrated in the wrong frequencies. The masks were alive. Or perhaps they had always been dormant, lying in wait for the fear, the excitement, the sheer vulnerability of desire. They adhered to our flesh, to our bones, and it was too late. The stall keepers, or whatever presided over the mask festival, watched silently. Their faces were hidden behind their own grotesque creations, nodding imperceptibly, encouragingly. I felt my mind splinter. I tried to pull the mask, to remove it by force, but it was not my hands anymore. The wood, the porcelain, the lacquer had integrated with my flesh. My skull burned with the effort. Memories intruded, not mine. Decisions I had never made, words I had never thought, yet spoke fluently. Then the Arbites arrived. They were sharp, imposing, mechanical in their efficiency. Their gloves pressed, claws gripped, servos whirred. They tried to remove the masks, but each attempt met resistance beyond material logic. The mask was part of me now. They could shred the straps, burn the adhesives, pulverize the surface, yet I felt it still clinging, like a parasite fused with identity. I screamed into the void, realizing the voice that issued forth was layered with multiple tones, mocking, sweet, demanding. I looked around at the crowd, each person fused to their own mask. The street resembled a river of shifting faces, laughing, grinning, some sobbing silently behind painted expressions, others twitching, trying desperately to preserve a sense of self. Identity was no longer fluid, it was weaponized, amplified. The mask did not merely conceal, it imposed, reshaped, possessed. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a broken window pane. My hands, no, the hands of the mask, raised to touch the porcelain cheeks. I had forgotten my own skin. The mask whispered secrets I did not want to hear. My sister stared at me, wide-eyed, and I realized she could no longer recognize me either. Love, recognition, memory, all fragmented. Hours or cycles passed. Time dissolved under the festival's relentless pulse. The Arbites withdrew after futile attempts, muttering in low voices about containment protocols and safety violations. The festival continued, unbroken, the masks now fully fused, the citizens moving in hypnotic choreography. There was no escape, no solace. Only the reflection of infinite faces, each fused with something that was no longer human, yet undeniably sentient, feeding on fear, excitement, and desire. I stumbled to a quiet corner, attempting to ground myself, to remember who I was before the festival, before the mask. But memory was not mine. The mask guided thought now, shaping emotion, twisting recollection into forms I did not recognize. I touched my face beneath the smooth veneer, but it was no longer flesh. My skull, jaw, and cheekbones were fused with lacquer, with wood, with whatever malignant artistry had animated this festival. I had no control. And yet, somewhere, deep beneath the fused layers, a trace of me remained, enough to know that I had not been chosen randomly, enough to know that I would have to adapt or disappear entirely. The festival pulsed around me, alive, breathing through the masses of mask-fused citizens, all moving in synchronized, grotesque harmony, each of us amplifying fear and desire simultaneously. The masks had taken our faces, they had taken our voices, and soon they would take our very selves. I realized with mounting horror that the festival was not for entertainment, it was for evolution, and in this evolution, identity itself was the first casualty. The Adeptus Mechanicus vaults of Vandrex Mortis were silent, their vast corridors lined with reinforced ceramite and adamantium, the low hum of power conduits echoing in the distance. Vault Delta had always been a place of dread, housing some of the most hazardous experimental materials ever recovered by the tech priests. It was meant to contain what should not exist, to prevent aberrant matter from destabilizing the entire hive world. Yet today, the air felt charged. Something inside the vault was alive, something aware. The anomaly, labeled X-Blood Variant A7, had been considered inert. Its retrieval from a minor containment chamber months prior was uneventful, and early scans suggested only minor reactive properties. But over the past 2 cycles, its behavior had changed. Slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, the mass began to swell within its reinforced containment unit. The expansion was measurable and consistent, yet defied all known biological laws. Magos Zalvan, lead observer of the experiment, adjusted his optical lenses, peering through layers of ceramite shielding at the subtle ripples across the mass. "It should not behave like this," he murmured, voice mechanical yet tinged with unease. The mass reacted to his observation almost instantaneously, a faint wave pulsing across its gelatinous surface. Instruments recorded fluctuations in density, energy output, and electromagnetic interference, data that made no sense under conventional physics. Attempts to incinerate the sample had failed. Initial plasma bursts charred only the surface, leaving the interior intact, which promptly expanded further. Subsequent exposure to high-energy fusion beams provoked violent reactions. The mass expelled material with tremendous force, striking the chamber walls and rebounding with a resilience that suggested deliberate adaptation. Magos Zalvan and his team recalculated. Every model predicted failure. Every protocol had been designed for the unknowable, yet even these were insufficient. Vault Delta was gradually becoming compromised. Sensors embedded in the walls began reporting microfractures and anomalous vibrations. Servitors tasked with observation malfunctioned under the stress, circuits overloaded by inexplicable interference. Even the ventilation ducts carried faint vibrations that resonated through the ceramite floor, a subtle rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. The mass itself had begun to demonstrate rudimentary morphology. Thin appendages, not fully formed limbs but testing the limits of spatial constraints, emerged and retracted across its surface. Metallic filaments intertwined with organic tissue, creating an adaptive biometallic lattice that responded to changes in temperature, light, and electromagnetic fields. Any attempt to touch or measure it remotely produced minor localized surges of energy, often enough to disable servitors or fry sensors. As hours passed, the growth accelerated. What had begun as a simple contained anomaly now filled nearly a third of the vault. Magos Zalvan ordered complete lockdown of the sector. All non-essential personnel were removed, leaving only remote monitoring arrays to maintain observation. Even this proved unreliable. Interference continued, sometimes erasing entire hours of collected data.
In a desperate bid to halt the expansion, chemical neutralization protocols were employed. Solutions of corrosive acids, oxidizers, and reactive solvents were introduced sequentially. Each caused only superficial degradation. The interior mass swelled and reorganized faster than before, forming dense clusters that reinforced its structure. Cryogenic suspension was attempted next. The sample responded with localized heating, creating bursts of vapor that carried heat into the surrounding environment. Attempts at mechanical compression were similarly futile. The mass seemed to anticipate stress points, redirecting expansion elsewhere. By the fifth cycle, Vault Delta was filled to nearly half its volume. Microfractures extended across the ceiling and walls, sensors intermittently reporting mass fluctuations that defied measurement. The X-blood moved with intention, the appendages probing the chamber, reacting to the presence of the surveillance equipment, and responding to environmental changes with alarming precision. Its growth was no longer simply physical, it was strategic, adaptive, aware. Magos Zalvan recorded what remained of the observational data, his voice steady but tense. This material exhibits cognitive function, not in a human sense, but in the sense of awareness and response. It adapts, it anticipates. We cannot predict its next phase. It is beyond containment. Attempts to sever the mass from its containment or destroy it through extreme measures were abandoned. The energy expenditure alone would have destabilized surrounding vaults, risking a catastrophic cascade failure across Sector 12. The X-blood had already colonized microfractures, infiltrating unseen crevices, likely feeding on ambient vibrations, electrical currents, and perhaps even the psychic resonance of the personnel who had once observed it. The final data transmission captured a chilling observation. The mass pulsed with rhythm. Remote sensors, barely operational, noted a beat-mic cadence, synchronized across its entire volume. It was not merely alive, it was communicating, perhaps calibrating its growth, perhaps sensing observers. Every fluctuation of mass, every expansion, every subtle undulation was purposeful. Vault Delta, once a fortress of the Adeptus Mechanicus's control, had become a monument to futility. The X-blood was no longer a sample, it was a presence, a creeping intelligence interwoven with its biometallic lattice, adapting, calculating, expanding, uncontainable. When the final recording ended, the transmission cut mid-entry. The last notes reflected the unspoken truth. The mass was free in every meaningful sense, and whatever it became next, the Mechanicus would never contain it. Outside, the vault corridors remained silent, humming with the false comfort of machinery, unaware of the patient, inexorable, intelligent horror that had already claimed the shadows. Vault Delta was silent, but the X-Blood pulsed, watched, and waited. And the Imperium, in all its confidence, would not notice until it was too late.
I never imagined I would live to write this, not with the rest of my squad gone, swallowed by the dark, unforgiving jungles of Galmor 9. Even now, the planet seems to pulse with life, each leaf, each vine, each dripping droplet of rain carrying a malevolent weight that presses against your chest, suffocating without mercy. They warned us this was a death world, one of the Imperium's most dangerous frontiers. They never mentioned this. We landed at the edge of the eastern equatorial basin, a broken plateau lined with jagged black cliffs and swamps thick with fog, so dense it felt like breathing in liquid shadow. The atmosphere carried a strange metallic tang, almost like iron, but mixed with something wrong. My commander, Sergeant Halvin, kept his Vox open, trying to maintain a semblance of order while we secured our perimeter. "Watch the ground. Anything could be hiding," he said, his voice taut with nerves, though he wouldn't admit it. None of us did. Fear was a liability we learned to swallow, but here, swallowing it made the fear grow inside, crawling under your skin like some predatory parasite. It started with the tracks. Small at first, human-like, but with claws sharp enough to tear through ceramite. Some had talon impressions where there shouldn't have been any. Others were impossibly wide, leaving deep gouges in the mud as though something immense had crouched here just hours before. Lieutenant Marek bent low, his respirator hissing. "These aren't normal animals," he whispered. He was right. Nothing native to Galmor 9 should move like this, leave prints like a wolf, a man, and something more. By midday, the rain came, turning the red clay soil into a sucking mire that swallowed boots and flares alike. We moved cautiously, scanning the tree line with our lasguns. I could feel it in my gut. This place was alive and watching. And then I saw it. Private Jalen, a rookie with more bravado than sense, disappeared behind a wall of ferns. A moment later, a howl tore through the jungle. Not human, not animal, but a guttural, bone-rattling cry that made my teeth chatter. We rushed forward and found him, or what was left. His body had changed, stature doubled, muscles knotting visibly beneath the skin. Fur sprouted from his arms and face in uneven patches. His eyes glowed amber in the dim light. He turned toward us, snarling, a sound that carried both human pain and the predatory satisfaction of a beast. Sergeant Halvin fired first, plasma bolts tearing through the fog, but they seemed to irritate rather than harm him. The creature lunged with impossible speed, knocking down a heavy flak wall in seconds. Marek and I barely dodged, falling into the swampy mud. The smell of iron, his blood, mingled with the wet rot of the jungle. It was intoxicating and vile all at once.
We tried to regroup. Command failed. Orders crumbled under the weight of reality. Those who weren't screaming were paralyzed by terror. It spread quickly, fear feeding fear, each soldier who panicked becoming a magnet for the transformation. I realized then the infection wasn't viral, chemical, or even psychic. It was emotional. Fear accelerated it. The more panic, the faster the change. We moved silently after that, a few of us who had learned to control the trembling in our hands, the quiver in our hearts. I kept reminding myself to breathe evenly, to speak softly, to maintain calm. It was the only thing that slowed the transformation. The rules were cruel but simple. Succumb to terror, and the beast claimed you. Resist,
and you retained your humanity a little longer. We made our way to an abandoned forward observatory, a crumbling spire once used by scouts. Inside, the walls were scratched with tally marks, crude warnings left by previous patrols who had failed to return. Their desperation had been obvious, etched into the metal with blood and claw marks. One mark, scrawled in hurried script, read simply, "Fear is the vector, calmness is the shield." I thought I understood for the first time. That night, the jungle's chorus changed, no longer simple wildlife sounds, but a constant low growl that rippled through the undergrowth, accompanied by footfalls too fast, too heavy to be human. We barricaded ourselves, lasguns trained on every shadow, listening as the creatures prowled closer. Each moment stretched into eternity. Each breath felt like inhaling knives. The first to succumb was Corporal Dren, shaking uncontrollably as he screamed. By morning, he was gone, replaced by a thing that had once been him. We kept moving, always moving through the endless swamps and jungles, the fog never lifting. Each encounter was a test of nerves, strategy, and endurance. Some nights we would hear the howl of Jalen, or what had been Jalen, echoing from above the canopy, a terrifying reminder that fear could manifest in flesh. Every rustle in the trees, every splash in the swamp could be the next attack, and it often was. The battles were not straightforward. Conventional tactics failed. Lasguns and grenades only worked intermittently, sometimes harming the creatures, sometimes provoking more rapid adaptation. They learned quickly, anticipating movement, responding to the angles of our fire. The rules of engagement in the Imperium were irrelevant here. Logic was useless. The jungle was a crucible, testing the limits of our minds as much as our bodies. Over days, or was it weeks, we encountered more mutations. A patrol group we passed earlier had been transformed, their bodies twisted into grotesque mockeries of man and wolf. Eyes glowed, fangs gleamed, and a cunning intellect flickered in their movements. Some retained vestiges of memory, calling out familiar phrases only to snap violently at our approach. Each encounter reinforced one lesson: only mastery over fear preserved humanity. By the fifth cycle, only 3 of us remained intact: Marek, Halvan, and I. We had learned to move without hesitation, to suppress every instinctive flinch, to ration our fear into controlled calculation. The creatures prowled relentlessly, yet avoided us in some moments, as if aware of our emotional discipline. It was a fragile survival strategy, teetering on the edge of madness. Eventually, we reached a high plateau overlooking the central basin. There, the full horror of Galmor 9 became evident. The jungles were alive with movement, hundreds of transformations in progress, creatures hunting, adapting, spreading through the fog like a living tide. It was no longer a mere patrol mission. It was a war for survival against something the Imperium had never catalogued, something no dossier could prepare for. From that vantage, I realized the truth of the planet. Galmor 9 did not simply harbor danger, it bred it, amplified it through fear, nurtured it with every shriek and howl. Calmness was no guarantee of survival, only a temporary shield against the inevitable. The forest seemed to pulse with intelligence, a collective mind of predator and prey intertwined, feeding off terror and instinct alike. We descended from the plateau, moving cautiously, the line between human and beast growing thinner with each step. Every sound, every flicker of movement became a question. Would this be the moment we fell, or would the discipline of our minds outlast the hunger of the forest? I write this now, the jungle stretching endlessly behind me, aware that if this record survives, it may be the only warning ever transmitted. The Imperium sends armies into unknown worlds thinking courage is enough, But here, on Galmore 9, courage is a tool, not a shield. Fear is the vector, calmness is the weapon, and survival depends on your mastery of both. I hear a howl in the distance, closer now than it should be. I steady my pulse, tighten my grip on my lasgun, and remind myself, calmness delays infection. Calmness preserves humanity. Calmness might be the only thing standing between life and the horror waiting in the fog. The forest waits, and it knows us.
The hive corridors of Cartham Hive Primus were suffocating, a labyrinth of steel, grime, and centuries of neglect. Even the air tasted wrong, thick with humidity, smoke residue from ancient forges, and the faint metallic tang of decay. I, Inquisitor Seraphin Vol, arrived accompanied by a small team of acolytes and servitors, each tasked with surveillance, documentation, and enforcement. We were ordered to investigate anomalies in Lower Hive Delta, reports of deceased citizens behaving oddly, moving through the streets, interacting with the living without hostility, almost politely. We entered the district as the sun failed to reach the lower levels, its rays blocked by layers of overhanging platforms and spires. Shadows pooled like ink along the walkways, distorted by flickering plasma lamps that sputtered unpredictably. My boots echoed hollowly, a sound that seemed to make the walls pulse as if aware of our presence. We were not the first inquisitorial team here, but I suspected we would be the last to fully comprehend what awaited. Our first encounter was with a resident in one of the narrow alleys. He appeared normal at first glance, a thin, wiry man with graying hair and a lined face, but something in the manner of his movement drew my attention. He nodded politely as we approached, and in the quiet of the corridor I heard him murmur, "Please do not trouble yourselves. Everything is as it should be." The words were soft, respectful, yet carried a weight that unsettled me. There was no threat, only insistence on normalcy, and the insistence itself was oppressive. We conducted our first interview in a temporary interrogation chamber within the sealed sector. The room was sparse, a single chair, a data tether for recording, and the hum of ambient power. The subject, a middle-aged woman identified as Lyra Neth, sat with impeccable posture. Her pale skin stretched taut over high cheekbones, her eyes alert yet devoid of fear. "Describe your daily activities," I prompted, noting the mechanical whir of the servitors recording her every word. "I attend my work as usual, Inquisitor," she said calmly. "The schedule is unchanged. No interruptions occur. I care for the children. I maintain my quarters. I greet neighbors. All is normal." She gestured to the window, an opening that looked on to the corridor. A corpse walked past, pausing to adjust a fallen sign. "See, everything is as expected. No anomalies." The statement should have been impossible. The figure outside moved with rigid grace, bowing slightly as it passed, yet there was no aggression, no malice, only courtesy. Autopsies were conducted immediately following the interviews. Our Adeptus Biologicus operatives documented each step meticulously. Corpses showed no signs of warp corruption. Vital fluids were absent, yet tissue remained intact beyond natural decomposition. Nervous systems were functional, though inert. Any motion or speech must have originated from a force beyond biology as we understood it. Measurements, scans, and readings were recorded on both standard cogitators and archival servitors, generating thousands of data points, none of which explained the observed behaviors. The hive was sealed after the initial observations. Vox channels were monitored, arterial checkpoints staffed by veteran Arbites. Despite these precautions, anomalies continued. Lights dimmed and brightened at precise intervals, as though acknowledging our movement. Doors opened silently and closed behind us, often trapping a servitor or forcing an acolyte to recalibrate their path. It became evident that the hive itself, or whatever force animated its inhabitants, was observing, measuring, and perhaps testing our responses. Our nights were sleepless. Each hour I traversed the corridors, recording encounters. I approached another resident, an elderly man who shuffled with a cane. "Your neighbors are missing," I said. "No, Inquisitor. Everyone is present. Some are merely in repose." He smiled faintly, bowing as he indicated a nearby doorway. Inside, a corpse lay motionless on a mat, hands crossed, eyes open, appearing to read a small book. He gestured to it casually, as if I might misunderstand. Each interaction layered dread upon dread. The dead were not violent. They were cooperative, structured, and courteous to an unnatural degree. A child ran past, laughing, brushing against a skeletal hand that waved in return. The sight made my stomach turn. Fear was irrelevant to these beings. They obeyed social convention even in death. Multiple interviews over the next cycles reinforced the disquieting pattern. A mechanic greeted us, thanking us politely for inspecting a malfunctioning reactor. A teacher in an abandoned school addressed her students, all corpses, with the patience of decades. Each interview was followed by careful cross-checking, procedural validation, and the constant reminder these entities were not possessed, not demonic, and not technically alive. They existed according to rules beyond the Imperium's understanding, and every attempt at classification failed. My acolytes began to show stress. Their hands shook during data entry. Their voices wavered when reciting protocols aloud. I reminded them repeatedly, maintain composure. The hive responded only to fear. Panic accelerated chaos. Calm preserved structure for now. We documented every observation with exhaustive precision. Times, gestures, patterns of interaction, anomalies in physiology. Thousands of entries accumulated over weeks, forming a dossier that may never be understood outside this sealed district. Late into the final cycle, I received a note, delivered by a silent courier, a small skeletal figure with no visible eyes. It contained only a single embossed card. The message was concise. "Dinner at my residence. You are requested. Your attendance is expected." The tone was civil, cordial, threat absent, yet the implication was clear. The polite dead were extending their etiquette to me, inviting participation in their ongoing ritual of normalcy. I stared at the card in my hand. Its surface seemed to pulse faintly, as if aware of my observation. Outside, the hive hummed with life and death in perfect synchrony. Doors opened and closed without touch. Lights dimmed to half power, as if approving my contemplation. The corridors themselves seemed to bend subtly, guiding my movement toward the unknown. In that moment, I realized the dead were not merely anomalous. They were sentient, deliberate, and structured. They adhered to a logic rooted in civility, procedure, and ritual, a logic that operated entirely beyond the Imperium's instruments or philosophy. Fear was irrelevant. Only respect, precision, and acknowledgement mattered. Missteps were noted but rarely punished. Compliance ensured survival, participation in their unending theater of existence. I recorded these final observations carefully, knowing that the dossier would survive me, even if my body did not. The hive waits, patient, polite, and eternal.
and I, for all my training and insight, am but a guest, walking corridors where death has perfected manners, and civility masks an unknowable agenda. As I prepared to approach the designated residence for dinner, my pulse remained steady. Calmness is survival, politeness is power, and the dead are patient, observing, and infinitely meticulous. I step forward. The doors swing open with a whisper. The hive has called, and I answer. Helios Minor stretched beneath an oppressive sun, its endless fields of golden grain rippling in the wind like the breath of a slumbering god. Yet, beneath this serene surface, darkness festered. The first reports arrived from the overseer's communication line. Small farming hamlets were reporting missing laborers, and those who remained spoke in hushed tones of shapes moving in the fields when no one should be there. They called them scarecrows, but the description failed to capture the unnatural menace that had begun to take hold. I arrived accompanied by a detachment of local militia, their weapons clanking lightly against the metal harnesses of their armor. The village of Tirus Hollow was our first stop, a settlement already whispering fear into the air. The streets were empty, doors ajar, tools scattered in mid-use as though the workers had been plucked from life instantly. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no evidence that might explain the vanishings. Field surveys revealed the first anomaly. The scarecrows themselves were no longer stationary. Each night they moved. At dawn they were found positioned at the edges of fields, standing at angles that suggested intent, forming geometric patterns across acres of crops. These formations were too precise to be accidental, too deliberate to be merely the work of wind or animal interference. The grain surrounding these configurations was already blackened, decayed into patterns that resembled sigils of an ancient, forgotten language. One evening, I accompanied a patrol to observe the phenomenon firsthand. Twilight descended in a blood-orange haze. The wind whispered across the fields, carrying a metallic scent that set the militia on edge. We crouched among the stalks, waiting. Hours passed. Then, as the moon rose high, a silence fell so complete it swallowed even the creaking of our armor. Shapes began to move along the rows. Scarecrows, yes, but they were animate, fluid, limbs twitching unnaturally. Their burlap heads swiveled, observing us, aware of our presence. I raised my hand to signal the patrol to hold fire. The chief sergeant's fingers twitched on his lasgun, his knuckles white. We watched in tense silence as the scarecrows methodically rearranged themselves, the rows bending and twisting into intricate designs. One field appeared to spell out a word in the local dialect, leave. Another displayed a series of sharp interlocking triangles, and the final formation seemed to depict the entire village, rendered in precise detail. Crops rotted where the scarecrows touched them, blackened to a crisp instantly, the effect spreading like infection from the base outward. One militia member, unable to withstand the horror, screamed. The scarecrows paused, and the effect seemed to focus on him, the stalks around his feet curling violently. Yet when I shouted, commanding him to stand firm, the decay ceased, sparing his life. It became clear. They were testing us, judging our resolve, as if sentient guardians of the fields themselves. Over the following days, entire farming settlements vanished. Records indicated that families and livestock disappeared overnight, leaving only empty fields in their wake. The local population fled toward administrative centers, spreading rumors of divine retribution or witchcraft. The militia attempted to pursue the phenomenon, but our sensors failed. The scarecrows were always just beyond detection, repositioning themselves, always one step ahead. The crops, twisted into their geometric forms, acted as markers, communicating in a language incomprehensible to us. I began to document the events with meticulous care. Each disappearance, each geometric pattern, every movement of the scarecrows was recorded, compared, and analyzed. There was a rhythm in the chaos, an inevitability in the vanishings, a narrative unfolding in silent communication across the fields. My notes read like scripture, a chronicle of a land where the natural order was upended and the harvest itself became the instrument of judgment. The local population spoke of ancient legends, spirits of the land, guardians angered by negligence, or curses placed by forgotten gods. I had dismissed them at first, but the precision, the inevitability, and the almost ritualistic nature of the phenomena made it difficult to argue against a higher, unseen intelligence at work. I observed a family farm during the night cycle. The father, a gaunt man named Rylus, attempted to barricade his home. Outside, the scarecrows gathered, forming a perimeter, each standing taller than mortal frames should allow. Their burlap faces tilted toward the barricades, heads jerking unnaturally, observing every movement. Rylus tried to shout, tried to command them away, but the wind carried his words in distorted echoes. The scarecrows did not advance, but instead reshaped the crops around his homestead. By dawn, the farm was erased from sight, leaving a field of blackened, twisted grain forming the image of his own house, now empty. I concluded that resistance was irrelevant. Observation, patience, and understanding were paramount. The scarecrows were not simply attacking, they were enacting a narrative, demonstrating control over the environment, enforcing an unspoken law across Helios Minor. Each night, as the patterns grew more complex, it became evident that the land itself had become a participant in a ritual older than memory, a performance where human presence was incidental, almost theatrical. In my reports, I noted that traditional countermeasures were ineffective. Weapons had no effect. Attempts to burn fields or destroy scarecrows resulted in the phenomenon simply relocating or accelerating. The only effective measure appeared to be observation without panic. Any fear, hesitation, or disorder only strengthened the reach of these animate sentinels. The chapter of my chronicle closes with the disappearance of the last known settlement in the Western Quadrant. A patrol sent to investigate the previous night found no sign of habitation, only the faint trace of geometric decay in the fields. The scarecrows stood as silent witnesses, aligned as if in ceremonial formation. My notes ended with a single, chilling line. The harvest is inexorable, and the scarecrow crusade will not be denied. The mythic, almost biblical inevitability of these events settled over Helios Minor like a shadow. Every stalk of grain, every pattern in the field became testament to a force beyond comprehension, enforcing its own order in a land where human will was meaningless. The folk of the agri-world would remember nothing but the fields themselves, blackened and geometrically perfect, and the quiet, eternal gaze of the Scarecrow Crusade. The first complaints were not taken seriously. In the lower residential blocks of Carthum Hive Primus, complaints were as common as mold in the ventilation shafts. The administratum categorized them under familiar headings: sanitation failures, minor heretical disputes, food distribution irregularities, domestic disturbances. The underhive had always produced strange stories. Too many bodies lived too close together for sanity to remain perfectly intact. But these reports did not sound like madness. They sounded like quiet fear. A woman in Block 94 Gamma filed the first record. Her husband had returned from a recycling shift in the fungal reclamation tunnels. Nothing unusual about that. Half the men in that district worked those tunnels. The fungus harvested there was processed into nutrient paste that fed nearly 250,000 residents. Yet, when he came home, he did not remove his work gloves. He did not eat. He simply sat at the table and stared at the air recycler vent. For 6 hours. When she asked what was wrong, he said only one thing. "Don't go near the gardens." There were no gardens in Block 94 Gamma. The woman assumed exhaustion. She slept. In the morning, her husband was gone. The door had never opened. The HAB unit had no other exits, and the air recycler vent had been unscrewed from the inside. The second report came 2 days later. Children in Block 112 Delta claimed their father was growing leaves. Their mother filed the complaint only because the children would not stop screaming. Arbeit's Medicaid officers arrived to examine the man. He appeared healthy. No fever, no mutation markers, no warp contamination. But when the Medicaid team attempted a blood draw, the man's skin split along the forearm like damp bark. Not bleeding, not tearing, opening. Inside the wound there was no muscle tissue, only pale green fibers packed tightly together like plant roots. The Medicaid team sealed the HAB unit and ordered quarantine. By morning, the entire family had disappeared. The door remained locked from the inside. The ventilation shaft grate was missing. 3 weeks passed before anyone noticed the pattern. The disappearances were concentrated around the same network of residential corridors connected to the lowest air recycling systems. These ancient machines processed air drawn directly from the deeper layers of the underhive, where abandoned districts stretched downward for kilometers into darkness. Few people visited those depths anymore. Not since the tunnel collapses, not since the spore blooms, not since the things that moved in the fungus forests. Officially, those depths did not exist. Unofficially, everyone in the lower blocks had heard the warning. Stay out of the underhive. The first confirmed transformation occurred in HAB Complex Theta 9. A family of 4 had gathered for their evening meal. Nutrient paste bricks, recycled water, the usual routine of 1,000,000 identical households. The youngest daughter noticed the smell first. "Why does it smell like soil?" The parents ignored her. Children invented smells all the time. But the smell grew stronger. Damp earth, wet vegetation, rotting leaves. The father stood and inspected the air recycler panel. The fan blades were turning normally. Filters were functioning. But the intake vents were covered in a thin dust. Green dust. When he touched it, the dust released into the air like spores. The family inhaled. Within minutes, the mother began coughing, then laughing, then crying. Her skin erupted in tiny green lesions that spread across her arms like lichen across stone. The father attempted to call the local Arbeits precinct, but the Vox system produced only a faint whispering sound. The daughter turned toward her brother. "What's growing on your neck?" Tiny stems were pushing through the boy's skin. Leaves unfurled slowly. The children screamed. The father tried to run to the corridor for help, but the door would not open. It had been sealed from the outside. Neighbors heard the screams, but no one came, because everyone in the corridor had already smelled the soil. Doors remained closed, lights remained off, families whispered to each other through walls. "Did you hear them?" "Yes." "Should we help?" "No." Silence spread through the corridor like fog, because people had begun to notice something far worse than the screams. Some neighbors were behaving differently. A man who had lived on the same floor for 12 years suddenly stopped blinking. A woman who worked the water filtration pumps had begun watering the metal hallway floor every morning. Another neighbor spoke only in short sentences about sunlight. There was no sunlight in the hive, not for 3 kilometers above them, and yet he insisted it was coming. Within days, paranoia replaced routine. Families began checking one another for signs: green dust on clothing, soil beneath fingernails, unnatural stillness. People watched their loved ones while they slept. Mothers inspected their children's skin for sprouting fibers. Husbands listened to wives breathing in the darkness to ensure the rhythm remained human. Every cough became suspicious. Every scratch of the wall sounded like roots growing through metal. One man in Block 77 killed his brother because he believed vines were growing inside his lungs. The autopsy revealed nothing, but 2 days later, the corpse sprouted moss. The Arbite sealed several corridors. It did nothing, because the contamination was not spreading through doors. It was spreading through air. The spores moved silently through ventilation shafts older than the Imperium itself. They settled in lungs, bloodstreams, skin. Some people transformed quickly. Others changed slowly over weeks. No one knew who was infected, not even the infected themselves. A maintenance worker named Halrex discovered the truth by accident. He was assigned to repair a malfunctioning air recycler deep beneath the residential levels. The work required entering one of the forgotten maintenance tunnels leading downward toward the abandoned underhive sectors. Halrex disliked the assignment. Everyone did, but he went anyway, because refusing work assignments attracted attention, and attention in the hive often ended badly. He descended alone. The deeper he went, the warmer the air became. Not mechanical warmth, biological warmth, breathing warmth. When he reached the final tunnel chamber, he saw the source of the spores. The entire cavern had become a forest. Not trees, not exactly. Towering plant-like growths stretched through the darkness, their trunks made from fused human forms encased in green fibers. Leaves the size of banners spread across the ceiling vents. Roots had penetrated the ventilation systems. They were growing upward, into the hive, into the air supply. And within those trunks, faces moved. Human faces. Eyes opened slowly from within bark-like skin. They watched Halrex. Some of them whispered, "Stay." He ran. He never reached the surface, because by the time he climbed halfway back through the tunnels, something had already begun growing inside his lungs. Back in the residential blocks, the paranoia finally turned violent. Neighbors accused neighbors. Families barricaded doors. Arbite's patrols found entire hab corridors abandoned. Sometimes they discovered rooms filled with green vines where people once lived. Sometimes they found nothing at all, only soil, fresh soil covering the floor, as if something had been planted. The worst part was the replacements, because not every infected person transformed into vegetation. Some remained almost perfectly human. Almost. Their skin grew slightly pale. Their breathing slowed. They spoke softly about patience, about growth, about the beauty of roots. And they always insisted everything was normal, very normal. A mother in Block 38 noticed her husband had begun sleeping standing upright near the air vent. When she asked why, he said calmly, "It helps the light reach me." There was no light. She did not sleep that night. She watched him until morning, and she realized something terrifying. Her husband had not blinked once. Eventually, the administratum issued a simple directive. Entire underhive districts were sealed. Air circulation was redirected. Thousands of residents were relocated. Official records described the situation as a localized fungal contamination event. The word plants never appeared in the reports, but rumors spread anyway. People whispered that something was growing beneath the hive, something patient, something spreading quietly through the lungs of the population, something waiting for the right moment to bloom. Months later, a small child in a newly relocated residential block asked her mother a question. "Why are there leaves coming out of the air vent?" The mother looked up. Tiny green stems were pushing through the metal grill. Fresh leaves unfolded slowly toward the room, toward the warm air, toward the people breathing inside. And somewhere deep below the hive, in the forgotten tunnels of the underhive forest, thousands of human voices whispered the same sentence: "Stay out of the underhive."
The first accusation was filed by a 12-year-old cadet. In the archives of the Scolum Progenium of Vandrex Mortis, accusations from students were not unusual. The institution existed to take the orphaned children of Imperial servants, officers, commissars, bureaucrats, and heroes, and shape them into the next generation of Imperial command. Children broke under that pressure. They accused instructors of cruelty. They accused classmates of heresy. They accused themselves of weakness. But the accusation written by Cadet Alaric Venn did not follow the usual pattern. The report was written carefully, as if the boy had taken great care to avoid sounding insane. The opening sentence read, "I believe Instructor Halveth is not human." The clerk who first read the document assumed it was a childish complaint about discipline. Instructor Halveth was known for harsh methods. Several cadets had fainted during his endurance lectures. Still, procedure required documentation, so the report was archived. No one questioned it further, until 2 weeks later when 3 more cadets submitted identical claims. Different instructors, same accusation. Not human. The Scolum Progenium was a fortress of discipline and order. Its stone halls had trained generations of Imperial servants. Every corridor was monitored by surveillance cherubs. Every lecture hall was recorded. Every dormitory had listening devices hidden in the walls. Nothing happened in the Scolum without being documented. So when the accusations reached the administratum liaison, he requested a simple verification review. The recordings were pulled. At first, the footage appeared normal. Instructor Halveth lecturing about tactical deployment, Instructor Meridius drilling cadets in weapon maintenance, Instructor Caldra overseeing physical training. Nothing unusual. But the archivist reviewing the footage noticed a small detail. During a 2-hour lecture, Instructor Halveth never blinked. The archivist rewound the recording, frame by frame. The instructor's eyes remained perfectly open for the entire duration, even when chalk dust struck his face, even when the lights flickered, even when a cadet collapsed from exhaustion. No blink. The archivist marked the anomaly. He then checked another recording. Instructor Meridius during weapons training. Again, the same detail. Eyes open, unmoving, watching, always watching. Cadet Alaric Venn had not stopped writing reports. After his first accusation was ignored, he began keeping a private journal.
The boy had learned early that the Skolum rewarded observation and punished imagination, so he recorded only facts. Instructor Halveth never blinked. Instructor Meridius did not eat during meal rotations. Instructor Caldra's reflection sometimes appeared distorted in the metal wall panels. Alaric also recorded something stranger. The instructors had begun repeating phrases, not exact phrases, similar ones. Phrases about obedience, about preparation, about readiness. At first, these statements seemed like normal Imperial doctrine, but they began appearing in subjects where they did not belong. A mathematics lecture included the phrase, "Compliance ensures survival." A history lesson ended with, "The Imperium must be ready for infiltration." A physical training drill concluded with, "Trust your instructors, they are guiding your transformation." Alaric did not like the last sentence because Instructor Caldra had never used the word transformation before.
The surveillance department initiated a quiet investigation. At the Skolum Progenium, investigations were conducted discreetly. Public panic could disrupt training programs that supplied officers to entire Imperial regiments. So the archivists began reviewing months of recordings. Patterns emerged. 3 months earlier, several instructors had taken medical leave simultaneously. 5 weeks later, they returned, but something had changed. Their walking patterns were slightly different. Their posture had become rigid, their speech rhythm slower. It was subtle enough that no one noticed during daily routines, but when the footage was compared side by side, the difference became undeniable. The instructors who returned from leave were not exactly the same people. The investigation team attempted to access medical records. Those files had been reassigned. The personnel responsible for the transfer no longer worked at the Skolum. In fact, the names listed in the transfer logs did not exist in any Imperial database. Someone had rewritten the personnel structure, quietly, perfectly, without leaving obvious errors. Cadet Alaric then continued observing. He began noticing something else. The instructors were appearing in places they should not be. Instructor Halveth entered the dormitory wing at midnight, even though his duties ended hours earlier. Instructor Meridius visited the archives without authorization. Instructor Caldra spent long periods standing in empty corridors, staring at surveillance cherubs. The cadets whispered about it. At first, they joked. Maybe the instructors were secret agents. Maybe they were testing the students. But the jokes stopped when several instructors began teaching subjects outside their expertise. Instructor Halveth began leading biology classes. Instructor Caldra replaced the literature instructor. Instructor Meridius appeared during religious instruction, despite lacking ecclesiastical credentials. Within 1 week, the entire faculty schedule had changed. No announcement was made. The old instructors simply stopped appearing. Cadet Alaric Venn discovered the truth by accident. During a late study period, he entered the faculty wing searching for a misplaced tactical manual. The hallway's lights were dim. The door to the staff lounge was slightly open. Inside, he heard voices. 3 instructors were speaking. Halveth, Meridius, Caldra. But they were not speaking Gothic. The language was wet, soft, almost whispering. Alaric watched through the door crack. Instructor Halveth's jaw moved strangely, stretching wider than human bone structure should allow. His tongue moved in long, slow shapes, as if tasting the air. Instructor Caldra's skin seemed too tight across the face, as if something beneath it was shifting. Instructor Meridius turned his head completely around, 180 degrees. His eyes locked onto the door. Alaric ran. The next morning, the curriculum changed completely. All textbooks were replaced overnight. History lessons no longer focused on past wars, but on infiltration tactics.
Biology classes emphasized adaptability. Psychology lectures discussed methods of influencing large populations. Religious instruction focused on obedience to authority without question. The official explanation claimed the revisions were part of an updated Imperial training initiative, but the changes spread with impossible speed. By the second day, every classroom used the new material. By the third day, the cadets began repeating the new phrases automatically. Compliance ensures survival. Trust your instructors. Preparation leads to transformation. Alaric tried to warn the other students. Some believed him. Others did not, because something else had begun happening. Some cadets started behaving differently. They stopped questioning orders. They spoke with calm voices. They smiled too often, and sometimes they stared at people the same way the instructors did, unblinking. The investigation department attempted to escalate the matter to higher Imperial authorities. The request was denied. The denial message arrived instantly. It stated that no irregularities existed within the Scolum Progenium. It also included a new directive. The surveillance department was to report all suspicious student behavior to the faculty, immediately, without exception. 2 nights later, Cadet Alaric Venn disappeared. His dormitory bed was empty. No signs of struggle. No door access logs. No corridor recordings showing movement. The only evidence he had ever existed was the journal hidden beneath his mattress. When the archivists recovered it, the final page contained only one sentence. "They are replacing us from the top down." 3 weeks later, a formal announcement was issued. The Scolum Progenium of Vandrex Mortis had been recognized for implementing a new educational program designed to improve Imperial loyalty and efficiency. The program would soon be adopted by other Scolum institutions across nearby systems. The announcement concluded with a reassuring message. The faculty of Vandrex Mortis remain fully committed to the future of the Imperium. The transmission included an official photograph of the instructors. They stood in perfect rows, eyes open, smiling, not one of them blinking. The first thing that changed was the sky. The workers of the industrial broadcast spires of Vandrex Mortis noticed it during the morning shift change. The sky above the towers, normally a thick gray ceiling of smog and transmission haze, suddenly divided into sharp rectangular shapes. Perfect rectangles, black borders, as if someone had drawn boxes across the heavens. At first, the workers assumed it was a malfunction of the broadcast arrays. The spires transmitted propaganda signals, tactical vox relays, and astropathic amplification waves across half the sector. Strange atmospheric distortions were not uncommon. But this was different, because inside the rectangles, words began to appear. Large yellow words, words that no one had transmitted. Words that hung in the air like gigantic subtitles. "The city trembles." The workers stared upward. Some laughed nervously. Others crossed themselves in the sign of the Aquila. Then the second line appeared. "A new villain enters the story." The ground shook. Something heavy struck the roof of Spire Theta 19. Metal screamed. The entire upper platform collapsed inward. Out of the smoke rose a figure that should not have existed in the universe of Warhammer. He wore purple armor, bright purple, not the dull, practical plating of Imperial war gear, but theatrical, gleaming, ridiculous armor with exaggerated shoulders and a flowing cape that snapped dramatically in the toxic wind. His mask was metallic silver. His eyes glowed green, and he stood in a pose that made no tactical sense whatsoever. Arms crossed, chest forward, cape billowing. A voice thundered across the entire Spire district. "Citizens of Vandrex Mortis!" The voice echoed like amplified theater. "Your world is now under the control of the mutant." Lightning flashed behind him. Not natural lightning, perfect zigzag comic lightning. Another panel appeared in the sky. A close-up of pure evil. The workers began screaming. Security forces rushed the platform. Heavy stubbers opened fire. Hundreds of rounds slammed into the purple armor. The mutant staggered backward dramatically. He clutched his chest. "No!" He paused, then looked down at the bullets bouncing harmlessly off his armor. Actually, that barely hurt. He straightened, but it looked very impressive. He raised one hand. Green energy burst outward. The blast threw dozens of soldiers across the platform in a perfectly symmetrical explosion that looked suspiciously artistic. In the sky, another narration box appeared. "The battle begins." Within minutes, the Imperial command network responded. A strike force of Adeptus Astartes from the Crimson Wardens chapter was already stationed in orbit. Their drop pod screamed through the polluted atmosphere and crashed into the industrial district like meteors. The Space Marines emerged through the smoke, 8 feet tall, ceramite armor, bolters ready. Their commander stepped forward. Brother Captain Valerius. His voice was calm and absolute. "Unknown entity, identify yourself." The mutant turned slowly. He placed one hand on his hip. "Identify myself." He pointed dramatically toward the sky. A new narration panel appeared. "The arch enemy of justice. The master of chaos. The terror of the comic world." He spread his arms wide. "I am the mutant." The Space Marines did not react. Brother Captain Valerius simply raised his bolter. "Target confirmed. Xenos classification pending." He fired. The bolter round exploded against the mutant's chest. Smoke cleared. The villain remained standing. He looked down at the damage. A tiny scorch mark. He tapped the armor. Dramatic, but ineffective. He turned toward the sky. "We need better special effects." The sky obeyed. A massive sound effect appeared above the battlefield. Krakoom! The explosion that followed was enormous. Not tactically effective, just enormous. Fireballs rolled across the spire rooftops with exaggerated color and perfect symmetry. The Space Marines advanced through the flames, bolters firing, chainswords roaring. But something strange had begun happening to reality. Bolter rounds no longer followed normal ballistic trajectories. They curved slightly. They made loud blam, blam, blam sounds that echoed unnaturally. Every explosion appeared brighter than physics should allow. Brother Valerius swung his chainsword. The blade struck the mutant's shoulder. The impact should have severed bone and armor instantly. Instead, it produced a loud metallic sound. Clang! The mutant stumbled backward dramatically. He spun twice, fell to one knee, placed a hand on his forehead. "Curse you, heroes!" He looked up again. "But you have not seen my true power." Another narration box appeared. "The villain strikes back." The mutant reached behind his cape. He pulled out a device. It looked like a ridiculous ray gun from a children's comic. He fired it. Green energy struck the ground. Instead of destroying anything, it created a perfect circular crater surrounded by dramatic lightning effects. 3 Space Marines were thrown into the air. They landed hard.
Their armor was undamaged, but the physics of the battle had clearly changed. Brother Valerius analyzed the battlefield. This environment is inconsistent. A tactical servitor attempted to calculate trajectories. Its cogitator produced only error messages because gravity itself was behaving strangely. Sometimes objects fell too slowly. Sometimes they fell too fast. Every action now looked theatrical, every movement exaggerated. Above the battlefield, the sky filled with more narration panels. The heroes are in trouble. Can they stop the mutant? To be continued? ? The Space Marines did not understand what those words meant, but they understood one thing. The enemy could not be killed by normal means. Brother Valerius fired again. Direct headshot. The mutant's helmet cracked slightly. The villain spun around dramatically, then slowly fell backward. Dust rose. Silence. The narration box appeared again. Is this the end? ? 5 seconds passed, then the mutant sat up. Of course not. He stood. The crack in his helmet vanished instantly. Villains never lose in their first appearance. He raised both hands. The sky filled with hundreds of new panels, explosions, sound effects, dialogue bubbles. The battlefield had become a living comic page. Reality itself had begun obeying narrative rules instead of physical ones. Brother Captain Valerius finally spoke a sentence rarely heard from a Space Marine. This situation is illogical. And somewhere beyond the visible sky, beyond the panels and narration boxes, something unseen was laughing, because the story was getting interesting.
The noble garden district of Vandrix Mortis was one of the few places on the hive world where the sky could almost be seen. Almost. High above the estates, the upper layers of the hive opened into artificial terraces filled with imported soil, decorative ponds, and rare vegetation grown under controlled luminarays. The wealthy of the planet had long insisted that even in a city of steel, smoke, and endless machinery, beauty must survive. The gardens were symbols of power. Each noble house competed with the others, filling their estates with statues, fountains, marble archways, and ornamental figures brought from distant worlds. Among these decorations were the gnomes. Hundreds of them. Small stone figures no taller than a child's knee. Each wore a pointed hat. Each carried some tiny tool: shovels, lanterns, pipes, fishing rods, watering cans. They were absurd things. Relics from ancient Terran folklore, imported centuries ago when a noble collector became fascinated with the strange humor of old pre-Imperial cultures. Most people ignored them. Servants dusted them. Children sometimes kicked them over. No one feared them. Why would they? They were statues. That assumption lasted until the third night of the harvest cycle. The first witness was a gardener named Harlan. He worked the terraces of House Velkari, trimming the luminous vines that climbed along the marble walkways. The night shift was quiet. Artificial moons shone softly across the gardens. The air smelled faintly of cultivated flowers and recycled water. Harlan had just finished adjusting the irrigation valves when he noticed something strange. One of the gnomes was facing a different direction. He frowned. He clearly remembered placing it beside the fountain earlier that evening, facing the pathway. Now it was facing the hedge wall. He walked over. "Someone moving decorations again?" he muttered. Servants were always rearranging the garden displays for the noble's endless aesthetic demands. He bent down and lifted the statue. It was heavier than he expected. Cold stone, nothing unusual. He placed it back beside the fountain, facing forward. Then he returned to his tools. 2 minutes later, he heard something behind him,
A faint scraping sound, stone against stone. He turned slowly. The gnome was no longer beside the fountain. It was halfway across the path, facing him. Harlan stared. The garden lights hummed quietly. The statue did not move. He laughed nervously. "Very funny," he said to no one. He walked toward it again, but before he could reach it, something else moved. Another gnome, then another. Along the edge of the garden path, dozens of the small statues slowly turned their heads toward him. Harlan's smile disappeared. "No," he whispered. The scraping sounds grew louder. Stone feet shifted across marble tiles. The gnomes were moving, not quickly, not dramatically, just slowly enough that each movement seemed impossible. One step, pause. Another step, pause. Hundreds of tiny stone faces turned toward the gardener. Their carved smiles suddenly looked very different. Harlan ran. He never reached the gate. The following morning, the servants of House Valkyrie discovered the garden empty. Harlan's tools lay scattered across the pathway. His boots were still beside the irrigation controls, but Harlan himself was gone. The estate security officer searched the property. They found no sign of violence, no blood, no footprints, just the statues, standing everywhere, watching. More than usual, someone noticed. There had been perhaps 24 gnomes before. Now there were at least 50. But the servants assumed the nobles had simply added new decorations. No one questioned it further, until the next night. The first noble to encounter them was Lady Marceline of House Drovak. She had been attending a late banquet when she stepped outside onto her private garden balcony. She enjoyed the silence of the terraces. The lower hive roared endlessly with machinery and traffic, but up here the air was almost peaceful. Almost. She noticed the statues immediately. They had gathered along the edge of the balcony, dozens of them, watching the garden. She frowned. "I do not remember ordering these." She stepped closer. One of the gnomes held a lantern. Another held a small shovel. Another carried a watering can. Ridiculous decorations. She kicked one lightly with her shoe. It toppled over. Absurd things. She turned back toward the banquet hall. Behind her, the fallen gnomes stood up again, silently, stone grinding softly against marble. Lady Marceline never heard it. She only heard the first impact. Something small struck the back of her leg, then another, then dozens. She turned just in time to see the statues moving, not slowly anymore. Hundreds of tiny figures swarmed across the balcony floor. Their stone tools rose and fell with mechanical precision. Her scream lasted 3 seconds. When the banquet guests rushed outside moments later, the balcony was empty. Lady Marceline was gone. The statues stood quietly around the fountain. There were far more of them now. Within 3 nights, the entire noble garden district had begun reporting disappearances. At first, the aristocrats dismissed the rumors. They blamed servants, political rivals, kidnapping conspiracies. No one believed the truth, until the statues attacked in daylight. It began at the estate of House Valtorin. A gathering of nobles had assembled to discuss the strange events spreading across the district. They sat around a marble table in the central courtyard. Wine glasses, expensive robes, irritated conversation. One of them laughed when a servant mentioned the statues again. "Stone toys cannot kill anyone." The servant tried to protest, but before he could finish, every gnome in the garden turned its head at the same time. Hundreds of tiny faces, hundreds of pointed hats, hundreds of silent stone smiles. Then they moved. The nobles stood in stunned disbelief. Some laughed, others tried to step backward. That was their mistake. because there were not hundreds anymore, there were thousands. The gardens of every estate were filled with them, rows upon rows of silent figures emerging from hedges, flower beds, fountains, and decorative ponds. They moved together. Not quickly, not loudly, just relentlessly. The first noble swung a chair at one. The stone shattered the chair leg. The gnome remained intact. Another noble tried to run. He fell almost immediately as dozens of tiny hands grabbed his ankles. The courtyard filled with screams. But the statues made no sound, not a single word, not a single laugh, just the constant scraping of stone feet across marble. By nightfall, the entire noble garden district had fallen silent. Servants, nobles, security patrols, all gone. When Imperial investigators finally arrived 2 days later, they found the estates abandoned. The gardens were perfectly arranged. Thousands of decorative gnomes stood quietly among the fountains and trees. Each statue wore the same carved smile. Each held the same tiny tools, and every one of them was facing the city. Watching, waiting, because small things are rarely frightening until there are enough of them.
No one on Vandrex Mortis remembered who built Terror Tower. Records claimed it had stood on the edge of the upper hive for over 3,000 years. Some archives insisted it was older than the hive itself, a relic from the earliest colonists who first turned the barren rock of the world into a fortress city of steel and stone. Others suggested it was once a noble prison, a place where traitors to the Imperium were publicly executed so the masses could witness the consequences of betrayal. Whatever the truth had been, the tower had long since fallen into disuse. Its black stone walls rose from the outskirts of the hive like the broken tooth of some ancient beast. Wind howled through the cracked battlements. Rusted iron gates hung crooked on ancient hinges. No one visited it anymore, until the signal arrived. The Vox transmission was faint and distorted when it reached the local Astra Militarum command post. Requesting assistance, multiple casualties, execution in progress. Then silence. Colonel Varick frowned as the transmission repeated again. Execution in progress, execution in progress. He dispatched a squad immediately. 12 guardsmen of the 88th Vandrex Line Infantry were assigned to the investigation. Nothing usual. The tower was likely occupied by smugglers, cultists, or scavengers hoping to avoid the endless surveillance of the hive. Sergeant Halrick led the patrol. They approached the fortress at dusk. The tower looked exactly as the records described it. Tall, narrow, ancient, its stone walls worn smooth by centuries of wind and acid rain. A single wooden scaffold stood in the courtyard beneath the tower's main archway. A gallows. Halrick frowned. "Stay alert," he said quietly. The squad moved through the rusted gate and into the courtyard. The moment the last soldier crossed the threshold, the gate slammed shut behind them. Every man turned. Private Guerin tried to force it open. It did not move. Halrick felt something tighten in his chest. "Probably a mechanism," he muttered. Then the bells rang. A deep iron bell somewhere inside the tower struck once. Then again. A voice echoed across the courtyard. "Execution begins." The soldiers exchanged confused glances. "What execution?" Guerin asked. No one answered. The bell rang again. Before anyone could speak, the wooden platform in the center of the courtyard creaked. Ropes dropped from the gallows. 12 ropes. Exactly 12. Sergeant Halrick opened his mouth to issue an order. He never finished the sentence. Something invisible seized the soldiers.
They were lifted from the ground as if gravity itself had turned against them. 12 guardsmen rose slowly into the air, their boots kicked uselessly. Invisible hands tightened ropes around their necks. Halric tried to shout. He could not breathe. The ropes snapped tight. 12 bodies hung from the gallows. The bell rang one final time. Everything went black.
Sergeant Halric opened his eyes. He was standing outside the tower. The same road, the same dusk sky, the same squad behind him. Private Garin scratched his helmet. "Sergeant, why are we back here?" Halric stared at the tower. His throat hurt, as if something had crushed it. "Did we already enter?" one of the soldiers asked. No one could remember clearly. Halric shook his head. Probably just nerves. But he could not ignore the strange pressure around his neck. "Move in," he ordered. They approached the tower again. The rusted gate stood open. The same gallows waited inside. Halric felt a cold dread in his stomach, but he could not explain why. "Stay alert." The squad stepped into the courtyard. The gate slammed shut. The bell rang. "Execution begins." This time the soldiers reacted instantly. "Contact!" someone shouted. Lasguns fired in every direction. Red beams struck the walls, the gallows, the ground. Nothing changed. Invisible force seized them again. They were lifted, screaming into the air. The ropes dropped. Halric tried to cut the rope with his combat knife. The blade passed through it like smoke. The rope tightened. 12 bodies swung. Darkness. Halric woke again. Outside the tower. Same road, same sky, same squad. Private Garin stared at him with wide eyes. "Sergeant, I remember something." Halric's throat burned. "So do I." One of the soldiers vomited. Another clawed at his neck. "We died," someone whispered. No one laughed. No one dismissed the idea, because every one of them felt the phantom pressure of the rope. Halric turned toward the tower. The gallows stood waiting, and somehow he knew something terrible. "This has happened before," he said quietly. "How many times?" Garin asked. Halric did not answer, because he did not know. The third attempt ended the same way, the fourth too, but something changed. Memory. Fragments of each previous death began to remain. At first it was only sensations, the tightening rope, the moment of falling. Then images began to return. The bell, the voice, the exact instant the ropes appeared. By the 7th cycle, the squad understood the pattern. The execution always happened, no matter what they did. They tried to destroy the gallows. It reappeared. They tried to leave the courtyard. Invisible walls stopped them. They tried to shoot the tower. The wounds healed instantly. The execution always happened, every time. Each loop ended with 12 bodies hanging from the ropes. Then darkness, then the reset. After the 15th death, the men stopped shouting. After the 20th, they stopped fighting. The cycles blurred together. The tower remained unchanged. The bell rang. The ropes fell. The soldiers died. And each time they woke again outside the gate. More memories returned with every loop. Soon they could predict every moment. Private Garin began counting. 32, he whispered during one reset. 32 executions. Maybe more, Halric said. Some soldiers began to break. One guardsman tried to hang himself before entering the tower. The loop reset anyway. Another tried to shoot his own squad mates. It changed nothing. The execution always came, always the ropes, always the bell. On the 43rd cycle, something else happened. The tower changed, only slightly. A crack appeared in the stone wall. A door that had never existed before appeared near the gallows. The soldiers stared at it in silence. Was that there before? Garin asked. No, Halric said. They approached the door cautiously. It opened into darkness. Inside the tower,
Corridors stretched endlessly upward, spiral staircases, iron doors, endless hallways. The bell rang again. Execution begins. The ropes dropped, but this time the soldiers ran into the tower. For the first time, the invisible force did not seize them immediately. They climbed the staircase, higher, higher. The bell followed them. Each step distorted reality slightly. Walls stretched, hallways twisted, doors appeared where none existed, but the soldiers kept climbing until the ropes found them again. Invisible hands dragged them backward down the staircase. The execution resumed. Darkness. Reset. More doors appeared with each cycle, more cracks, more distortions. Reality inside the tower was breaking. Time was no longer stable. Sometimes the soldiers encountered echoes of themselves, ghostly versions running through the halls, dying again and again. One soldier saw dozens of his own corpses hanging in the tower chamber. Another saw the gallows multiplied across infinite rooms. The loops were stacking, fracturing. Halric began to understand something terrible. "This tower isn't trapping us," he said during the 61st cycle. "It's learning." "Learning what?" Garen asked. Halric looked at the gallows. "Fear." The bell rang. The ropes dropped. But this time the soldiers did not resist. They stood quietly, waiting, because they understood now. The execution would always come, and the tower would always reset until something worse arrived. The ropes tightened. The soldiers died again. Darkness. When Halric opened his eyes again, he noticed something new. There were 13 ropes on the gallows, but only 12 soldiers. He stared at the empty rope. The bell rang. A voice echoed across the courtyard. Not the same voice as before. A younger voice, a curious voice. "Again?" it whispered, and the execution began.
No one saw the carnival arrive. At dusk, the planetary capital of Vandrex Mortis was exactly what it had always been. A vast hive metropolis of iron towers, smoke-choked skies, endless traffic of cargo lifters, and the constant mechanical chant of the Imperium's machines. At dawn, it was something else. The first report came from an orbital survey station. Operator Helis reported a sudden anomaly in the city's central district. At first, the Auspex readings appeared to be malfunctioning. Massive structures had appeared where none had existed hours before. Entire plazas were now occupied by impossible architecture, spiraling towers made of striped metal, vast mechanical arches shaped like smiling faces, spinning wheels of light rising hundreds of meters into the polluted sky. The operator assumed sensor error. Then visual confirmation arrived. A carnival had appeared in the heart of the capital. Not a small festival, an entire city of rides, tents, lights, and towering machines. Bright banners fluttered where manufactorums had stood the night before. Golden gates shaped like enormous jaws opened toward the main avenue. Above them hung a massive sign written in glowing letters. "Welcome to Horrorland. Come play." Citizens gathered cautiously around the entrance. Hive residents were not strangers to strange events anymore. In recent weeks, they had seen masked citizens fuse with grotesque faces, gardens overrun by murderous statues, and even entire districts vanish without explanation. But this was different. This was cheerful. Music drifted from the gates. A playful melody carried on the wind, accompanied by bells and distant laughter. Servitors passing near the entrance abruptly halted. Their optics flickered. One by one, they turned toward the gates and began walking inside. No command had been issued. Still, they walked. Soon, citizens began following. Curiosity overcame fear.
A woman carrying a basket of ration bars stepped through the gates first. Nothing happened. She turned around and waved. "It's safe!" she shouted. Moments later, dozens more entered. Then hundreds. Within an hour, thousands of citizens filled the carnival streets. The city authorities attempted to respond. Arbeits units arrived at the perimeter. They issued a single command over loudspeakers. By order of the Imperium, this district is now under investigation. All civilians must evacuate immediately. The carnival music grew louder. A mechanical announcer's voice echoed across the streets. "Welcome, visitors. Horrorland has been waiting for you." The gates slammed shut. Inside the carnival, the streets twisted like a dream. Colorful lanterns hung from wires, stretching between massive tents. Rides rotated slowly above the crowds. Impossible machines of spinning metal arms, floating platforms, and towering spiral tracks. The air smelled of sugar, oil, and something faintly rotten. Citizens wandered through the carnival in confused fascination. Games lined the walkways. Each stall was run by figures wearing elaborate costumes, smiling masks, striped uniforms, oversized hats. Some looked human. Some clearly were not. At the first stall, a sign read, "Test your courage." A young man stepped forward. "What do I do?" he asked. The masked attendant pointed toward a long, dark tunnel. "Just walk through." The man laughed nervously and entered. 10 seconds later, a scream echoed from inside. The crowd fell silent. Then the man emerged again. His face had changed. A grotesque mask had fused permanently onto his skin. His mouth stretched into a permanent grin. He began laughing uncontrollably. The crowd backed away. The attendant clapped politely. "Winner!" Further inside the carnival, another zone opened into a vast arena surrounded by metal fences. A banner overhead read, "Monster Blood Challenge." Inside the arena, a massive pool of green slime pulsed slowly. Citizens were invited to cross a narrow bridge above it. The first volunteer stepped forward confidently. Halfway across the bridge, the slime surged upward like a living creature. It swallowed the man instantly. The slime expanded, growing larger, heavier. Another banner lit up above the arena. "New high score!" Across the carnival, another district resembled a vast garden maze. At first glance, it appeared peaceful. Stone paths wound between decorative statues. Small gnomes lined the walkways. Visitors wandered deeper into the maze. None of them noticed when the statues began moving. One gnome stepped forward, then another. Within seconds, hundreds of tiny figures surrounded the visitors. Screams filled the maze. By the time anyone reached the entrance again, the paths were empty. Only the gnomes remained, standing perfectly still. The carnival continued expanding throughout the day. New districts appeared every hour. A towering iron fortress emerged near the central plaza. A sign outside read, "Terror Tower Live Experience." Citizens entered eagerly. None returned. In another section, a swamp-like environment appeared beneath artificial moons. Visitors heard distant howls. The werewolves of Galmore 9th emerged from the mist, and the hunt began.
Imperial forces attempted to contain the situation. 3 companies of the Crimson Warden Space Marines deployed near the carnival gates. Their commander surveyed the scene from a rooftop. Identify the enemy. No one could. The carnival did not behave like a demonic incursion. There were no warp storms,
No cult activity, no psychic signatures, just games and laughter. The Marines advanced toward the gates. The moment they crossed the threshold, the carnival reacted. New attractions activated instantly. A towering ride shaped like a massive rotating wheel descended from the sky. Energy fields locked the Marines into separate compartments. The machine began spinning, faster, faster, faster. Gravity shifted. Bolter rounds flew uselessly into the air. Even Astarte's physiology struggled against the impossible forces. The ride stopped abruptly. The compartments opened. The Marines stepped out disoriented. Waiting for them were dozens of monsters from across the carnival. Slappy, the dummy, sat atop a small throne. The haunted masks surrounded the plaza. Monster blood slithered across the ground. Werewolves prowled the shadows. Gnomes lined the rooftops. The carnival announcer's voice returned. Bonus round! The battle began. Throughout the capital, the carnival continued spreading. Entire districts vanished beneath its expanding lights. Civilians were drawn into games they did not understand. Some survived, many did not. Each victory seemed to strengthen the carnival itself. More rides appeared, more monsters emerged. By nightfall, the entire central hive had transformed into a surreal landscape of twisted attractions and lethal games. High above the city, a massive tower of lights formed at the center of Horrorland. From its peak, a single figure watched the chaos below. Small, shadowed, almost childlike. The figure tilted its head with curiosity, and the carnival grew larger still. The ritual chamber aboard the black ship Penance of Truth was older than most hive cities. Its walls were carved from basalt transported from Terra 10,000 years earlier, etched with sigils meant to discipline the mind and anchor the soul. Golden cables hung from the vaulted ceiling like the roots of a sacred tree, feeding power into the vast psychic amplifiers arranged in a perfect circle. At the center of the chamber knelt 9 psychers. Their robes were white. Their eyes were blind. Each had spent years in preparation for this single act, to speak across the Imperium and seek the voice that had guided humanity for 10 millennia, the Emperor of mankind. Inquisitrix Seraphine Vol stood behind the psychic circle, her hands clasped behind her back. The galaxy was unraveling. Carnivals appeared overnight on hive worlds. Statues moved. Masks consumed identities. Creatures from children's nightmares hunted entire regiments. None of it behaved like chaos. None of it answered to the ruinous powers. The warp itself had remained strangely quiet, which meant there was only one authority left to consult. Seraphine spoke softly. Begin the invocation. The lead psyker raised trembling hands. Golden runes ignited across the chamber floor. A low vibration spread through the stone like distant thunder. One by one, the psychers opened their mouths. 9 voices spoke the same ancient prayer. Master of mankind. Their minds opened. The ritual began. The Imperium unfolded before them. To most mortals, the warp was chaos incarnate, endless storms of emotion, madness, hunger, rage, despair. But to trained psychers, it had shape, structure, currents. They drifted through that psychic ocean now, their souls bound together by the ritual. They searched for a single presence, a beacon brighter than any star, the Emperor. In every previous attempt across centuries, that presence had always been there, distant, silent, but undeniable. Tonight, the warp looked different. It was not turbulent. It was not raging. It was still. The psychers drifted through a vast psychic darkness that felt strangely hollow. The currents of rage that normally marked the influence of Khorne were absent. The endless rot of Nurgle was quiet. Even the decadent whispers of Slaanesh seemed distant. The Imperium had not gone silent, but something had interrupted its rhythm. One of the psychers spoke through the link. "I cannot feel the storms." Another whispered, "The currents are wrong." Seraphine listened through the psychic relay. "Continue," she ordered. "Find him." The psychers pushed deeper. Their minds spread outward like lanterns in the dark. Across the warp, they saw the usual horrors. Demons prowled in distant currents. Warp predators drifted between realities. But none of them reacted to the strange disturbances that had begun appearing in the material galaxy. Carnivals, masks, living statues. Not one demon cared. That alone was wrong. Demons fed on emotion, on fear, on suffering. Entire worlds were now drowning in both, yet the warp remained uninterested. The psychers continued searching. At last they found what they had been seeking, a light, faint but unmistakable. The Astronomicon, the Emperor's psychic beacon, burned across the Imperium like a distant sun. They approached cautiously. Every psycher who had ever touched that light described the same experience: overwhelming power, ancient awareness, the sensation of standing before a god. The 9 psychers prepared themselves. Together they reached toward the light. "Master of mankind," their thoughts carried the message outward. "Humanity calls to you." The Astronomicon burned. It did not respond. They tried again. "Great Emperor, the galaxy faces a threat we cannot understand." The psychic beacon continued shining silently. One of the psychers faltered. "He hears us," she whispered. "He must." Seraphine leaned forward. "Ask about the anomalies." The psychers obeyed. "What are these creatures?" Silence. The warp remained motionless around them. Then something strange happened. One of the psychers felt observation. Not communication, not guidance, just attention, like an ancient intelligence quietly watching. The psycher spoke again. "These beings, they are not daemons." No answer came, but the Astronomicon flickered slightly. A small pulse of light rippled through the Imperium. It was not speech, not a message, but it was the first reaction they had seen. The psychers understood. These creatures had nothing to do with chaos. They were something else entirely. The psychers expanded their awareness across the warp. They searched for signs of the Goosebumps entities. They found none. No warp signatures, no psychic trails, no demonic echoes. The carnival on Vandrex Mortis burned with impossible energy, but the Imperium remained untouched. That should have been impossible. Nothing in the galaxy manifested without leaving some psychic mark. Every emotion, every thought, every nightmare, all of it echoed within the warp, except these things. One of the psychers finally understood. They do not belong here. Another asked, "Then where?" The answer emerged slowly, not from the warp, but from logic, from pattern, from observation. The psycher whispered the realization. They do not feed on emotion. They do not draw power from souls. They do not follow the laws of chaos. Seraphine listened carefully. What do they follow? The psycher hesitated, then spoke the most unsettling conclusion of the entire investigation. They follow narrative. The ritual chamber grew silent. Seraphine frowned. "Explain." The psyker's voice trembled. "These creatures behave according to story logic. Events unfold like chapters. Characters gain roles. Rules shift depending on dramatic tension." Another psyker continued the thought. "The stronger the fear, the stronger the story. The stronger the story, the more real the monsters become." Seraphine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the warp. "So they are feeding on fear." "Yes, but not like daemons." The psyker spoke the final word slowly. "They feed on the structure of the story itself." The Astronomicon pulsed once more. The psykers turned toward it instinctively. The Emperor still did not speak, but his silence felt deliberate, ancient, knowing. Seraphine understood the implication. For 10,000 years, humanity had battled chaos, the warp, the darkness of its own emotions. But this threat was something entirely different, something older than the Imperium, older than the warp, something that existed in a different layer of reality altogether. Not a god, not a daemon, something simpler, something stranger. The psyker whispered the final conclusion. "They are narrative organisms." The Astronomicon shone silently, and the Emperor said nothing. The reports were sealed. Across the Imperium, thousands of documents were stamped with the same classification. Anomalous event. Status contained. The words appeared on data slates, cogitator archives, and inquisitorial records. No explanation followed them. Entire settlements had vanished. Carnivals had appeared overnight. Creatures that should never have existed had walked openly beneath the sky. Now the records described everything in the language of bureaucracy. Contained, stabilized, resolved. No one said the word victory. On Vandrex Mortis, the carnival grounds were empty. The great iron gates of Horrorland stood half open, rusting slowly beneath a sky of gray industrial clouds. Torn banners hung motionless above silent rides. The Ferris wheel did not turn. The laughter had stopped. Servitors moved carefully through the abandoned park, collecting fragments of machinery and burned amusement booths, while Mechanicus adepts catalogued every object. They found broken masks. They found shattered gnomes. They found pieces of carnival games still humming with strange energy. They did not find the monsters. The rides were dismantled. The gates were sealed. The land was declared restricted territory. Within a week, the carnival was gone. The administratum filed its final report. Anomalous entertainment structure. Status dismantled. No one mentioned that the ground still smelled faintly of sugar and smoke. On Helios Minor, the scarecrows stood motionless once more. Farmers returned cautiously to their fields. The geometric scars across the crops remained, black shapes carved into the soil like enormous symbols. No one could explain how they had formed. The Adeptus Mechanicus attempted several harvest cycles. Nothing grew where the patterns had appeared. Eventually, the area was declared spiritually contaminated. The fields were abandoned. On Cartham Hive Primus, the dead stopped speaking. The district once called Dead Hive was sealed behind walls of plasteel and quarantine wards. Inside those walls, thousands of corpses remained seated at dinner tables, in apartments, in narrow alleys, perfectly still, perfectly silent. Inquisitorial records listed the situation with clinical precision. Undead phenomenon. Activity inactive. No further notes were added.
Across the galaxy, the monsters vanished one by one. The masks loosened and fell away. The plant creatures withered. The mutant dissolved into fading panels of colored light. The lawn gnomes returned to stone. The carnival rides rusted. Even Slappy disappeared. One morning, the governor's palace discovered the diplomatic relic sitting alone on a polished table. The dummy no longer spoke. Its painted smile remained. The governor ordered it destroyed. The Adeptus Mechanicus refused. They placed the doll inside a containment vault, just in case. Months passed, then years. The Imperium moved on. There were always new wars to fight, new rebellions, new heresies. Compared to the endless violence of the galaxy, the strange events surrounding the monsters began to look like a minor historical curiosity. Most citizens never heard about them at all. The Inquisition sealed the last archives. The final classification appeared in crimson ink. Threat level, dormant. Far from Vandrex Mortis, far from Helios Minor, on a distant hive world whose name mattered little in the great records of the Imperium, life continued as it always had. Factories roared. Smoke climbed endlessly toward the polluted sky. Billions of workers moved through narrow streets and dim corridors beneath flickering lumen lamps. In the lower levels of Hive District 77, a child searched through a pile of discarded objects behind a hab block. The boy was small, perhaps 9 years old. His name was Talon. He had learned long ago that the refuse piles of the upper districts sometimes contained useful things, broken tools, bits of food containers, occasionally even books. Books were rare. Most children in the lower hive had never seen one. Talon moved pieces of scrap metal aside carefully. Something thin and rectangular caught his attention. A book. It was old. The cover was plain black. No title, no author, no Imperial markings. He brushed dust from the surface and opened it. The pages were blank. Every page. Talon frowned. He flipped through the book slowly, still blank. He shrugged and sat on a broken crate, turning back to the first page. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ink appeared. It did not drip from a pen. It did not spread like liquid. The letters simply formed themselves across the paper, slowly, patiently. Talon watched the words appear, line by line. He read them quietly. Welcome back. The boy blinked. The letters were still forming. More words began to appear beneath the first line. Behind him, deep within the endless machinery of the hive, a faint sound drifted through the dark corridors. A laugh, soft, childlike, and very far away. The Imperium declared the incidents contained. Reports were sealed, witnesses reassigned, entire worlds quietly removed from public records. Officially, nothing unusual had happened. Yet a troubling conclusion remained among the few scholars who studied the fragments. The entities were not demons nor servants of chaos. They behaved like stories. They appeared, escalated, terrified their audience, and vanished once the narrative ended. Somewhere in the galaxy, on a quiet hive world, a child opened a strange book with no title. The first words slowly wrote themselves across the empty page. Welcome back. A faint laugh echoed in the dark, and somewhere another story began.